Once upon a time, in a room full of wonders, where every step leads to magic, and the journey of a true story begins here, with amazing guests and true miracles. Please like and subscribe for more amazing videos.
Did my residency and was a professor at the Seattle Children's Hospital. And, you know, I never really even thought about religious things. My training as a doctor pretty much consumed everything. But I was in Pocatello, Idaho. Out of Seattle Children's Hospital, we flew to Alaska, Montana, Idaho, Oregon to pick up critically ill children and bring them either back to Seattle or, in this case, to Primary Children's Hospital in Idaho. So I picked up a little girl there. She had drowned in a swimming pool and she was underwater for 20 minutes. And we were successful in resuscitating her. But frankly, I did not think that she would survive. In fact, I told her parents to come in and say goodbye to her because I was convinced that she would not live. She was in a profound coma. Just the way she presented, very few children or adults survive. And yet she did. And it's just one of these odd things in life, that can change your life in a second. I just happened to see her. I was working also in a clinic in Idaho, and I saw her seeing another doctor for follow-up after she was discharged from the hospital. And I said, "Oh, I know you. I know you don't remember me, but I spent, a grueling day trying to resuscitate you." And she looks at her mother and she goes, "Oh no, I know you. You put a tube in my nose." And she then went on to describe everything that had happened to her while she was clinically dead. She said she was floating above her body. She heard the nurses talking. She heard me talking to other physicians. She accurately said, repeated what we said. She said, "I took you into another room," or that, I had taken her into another room that had a big machine like a donut, which was her description of a CAT scanner. And, go with those patients, we taped their eyes closed, so there's no way she's seeing any of this, and she's not hearing anything. She didn't even have a gag response. She didn't have a blink response. She had what's called a coma score of 1. And so patients like that are not hearing anything. And she saw the look on my face. I was like going, "Oh, great." And, how could this be? And she pats me on the wrist like this. And she goes, "You'll see, Dr. Morse. Heaven is fun." So I returned to Seattle Children's Hospital, and I wanted to see why this happened. We actually thought it was probably from a lack of oxygen to the brain, or maybe the many drugs that we give patients during resuscitation. But we went ahead and we designed a study. We interviewed all survivors of cardiac arrest at Seattle Children's Hospital over 15 years. So every single child that was resuscitated. And there was only 26 children. Unlike what you see on TV, if your heart stops beating, by and large, you're not going to survive. Or if you do, you're not going to return to full consciousness and health. Then we took those children and we carefully compared them to control patients who also had a lack of oxygen, who were treated with the same drugs, were in the same scary intensive care unit, and by and large, they and their parents thought they were going to die. They don't have the medical knowledge to know that we took these two groups, one group that we felt would survive and one group that we felt would not. And to our great surprise, 24 out of the 26 children who survived cardiac arrest described having a near-death experience. They described going into this light. They often described heaven. They met grandmothers. One child says to me, "Well, I saw my grandmother." I said, "Oh, okay. What was that like?" She said, "Oh, I was just so shocked to see her," because she had previously passed. Now, this is what I want to talk to you about today, because your show is about miracles. And I want to tell you that we as physicians at Seattle Children's Hospital, and I think everywhere, we had no idea that these children had had this experience. In fact, I did my study with the head of the intensive care unit, the head of the Department of Neurology, and the head of the Department of Psychiatry. So we were the medical establishment. I always hear people say, "Oh, science doesn't believe in this stuff." No, we were the medical establishment, and we definitely showed that near-death experiences are real. And we published this in the American Medical Association's pediatric journal, the most prestigious journals. But as the department head of psychiatry said to me, he said, "I don't think we're going to hear any near-death experiences from these children, because after all, if anybody was going to hear an experience, I would have heard it already. That's what we think." And yet I said to a little girl, I said, "So why haven't you told anybody about your experience?" And she looks at me and she goes, "I didn't think you were supposed to be able to talk to God." So she, even her at her young age, knew that in our society today, you can believe in God, you can go to church, but if you say you actually talk to God, they label that as crazy. And so as a result, these children hadn't even told their parents of their experience. So I had the privilege of hearing their experiences for the first time. I can't tell you how important that is. One of the reasons I'm on your show, other than to talk about miracles, because I want people to understand the reality of miracles. But when you hear these experiences for the first time, they're not making it up. They're describing something real that they can't possibly understand. I'll give you an example. One young girl nearly died. She did die. Was clinically dead. And I want to put a needle in her heart to resuscitate her. So that's near death. And she says to me, she describes, her experience. She said, "I heard you asking the nurses for that crash cart thing." And then she said, "And then I was out of my body." And then she goes, "And then I was built." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And she goes, "That's what I'm trying to figure out." So that's not a story she's making up. I'll give you another example. This young man, his parents were ski instructors, and they came home from teaching skiing late one night in the driving snow, and their car hit a guardrail and flipped over into the river below, and he was underwater for 45 minutes. And, he, as we say in the intensive care unit world, if you're not warm and dead, you're not dead. And so sure enough, when we warmed him up, he recovered. So we asked him about his experience. Never told anybody, didn't even tell his parents. And I said, so what do you remember about that time? So we don't ask him leading questions. We didn't say, did you go to heaven? Anything like that. We asked these bland questions. What do you remember? And they were the same questions we asked our control patients. The exact same questions. Our control patients didn't remember anything. But this young man says to me, well, I was in a huge noodle. He says, a noodle? And then he looks at me and says, no. It couldn't have been a noodle because noodles don't have rainbows in them. And he said he went down this noodle, and first he was in the animal heaven, and then he went to human heaven. So, again, hearing the experience for the first time is its authenticity. After he then repeated that story, he told his parents, and then, of course, he's telling it again and again. And then it's always the tunnel. He never talked about the noodle again. So, hearing these experiences for the first time from children who've never described them, who thought that it was just a crazy dream, is, something that I feel these are sacred stories, and I want to share with you. I trained at Johns Hopkins, so, we're not into touchy-feely medicine. I was always taught when you're dead, you're dead. The brain creates consciousness. So when you die, there's no further consciousness, etc. But I learned something very different from these children. One girl said to me, I wasn't dead. I wasn't dead at all. Some part of me was still alive. So this opened up my mind and my heart to these types of spiritual experiences in general. And so I want to share with you exactly what I'm talking about. I worked for Airlift Northwest, which is an air transport company. As I said, we brought patients to Seattle Children's Hospital, University of Washington. But I also was in private practice, and I had a patient once. Her name was Taryn Hedlund, and she was born with a genetic disease that you always die from. It's universally fatal. It's called Wolman's disease. Diagnosed by electron microscopy examination of a liver biopsy. And we suspected that this baby had it because at a month of age, she weighed 2 pounds less than she did at birth. And she looked like she was going to die at any moment. I got back her diagnosis. We had sent it out to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who are the experts on this at that time. And it was Christmas Eve. So I said, what am I going to do? Am I going to bring these parents in on Christmas Eve and tell them, that their child has this universally fatal disease? But I did, because I just, I'm a doctor. It's my job to tell them what I know about their child. It's not my job to protect them or to filter things. They deserve to know. I would want to know. So I brought the parents in on Christmas Eve, and I told them the diagnosis. And the father wept. And I'll never forget his hands twisting as he wept. And they went home. But Taryn didn't die. A month went by. They brought her back for follow-up. She gained weight. Then, next month, she gained more weight. The mother and I don't even talk about this because I think we're afraid we're going to jinx it or something. Like, what's going on here? 6 months went by, and Taryn was now normal weight for a child or infant her age, developing normally. And finally, the mother says to me, "What's going on here? I thought you said she had woman's disease." And I said, I don't know what's going on here. I have no explanation for you. But you know my research on near-death experiences. You know that I've learned that sometimes miracles happen. I've seen children who were clinically dead come back to life. I've resuscitated a young boy who died on the lobby floor of admissions at Children's Hospital when his pacemaker failed as his parents were checking him in. I resuscitated him. My team, it's not me, it's an entire team. And he looks up at me and he goes, "That was weird. You guys just sucked me back into my body." So I just shared this with the parents. I said, there's more to life than we know. Okay. So they go home and they say that, the family, what did Dr. Morse tell you today? And he said that sometimes there's spiritual explanations for this. So this now goes out to the family, the extended family. To her brother-in-law. Her brother-in-law was the black sheep of the family. Every family has one. He's been on Unsolved Mysteries. So, I'm not breaking any confidences, by telling you, struggled with substance abuse, assault to the earth kind of guy, worked with his hands, construction, and just really never interacted with his family. So here's what he says. He told Mrs. Headland, he said, the weirdest thing happened to me on Christmas Eve. He said, I lay down that night to go to sleep and heard a voice. And the voice said to me, "Go see Taryn Headland and put your hands on her belly." It's like, this isn't real. He's looking around the room because it sounds like a voice just like we're talking now. And the voice says, "Go see Taryn Headland." And he goes, "This is crazy. I don't know, I don't believe you. All right, maybe tomorrow I'll go by and see her." And the voice says, "No, tomorrow is too late. You must go tonight." So he gets up. He doesn't even tell his wife. He's like, he's so disbelieving. As he told me, he said, "I'm the last person, to facilitate a miracle. I don't go to church. I don't believe in God. People who do believe in God really don't want to have anything to do with me." That's what he told me. And so he told his wife he's going out for a pack of cigarettes. And instead, he goes over to Taryn Headland's house. And they didn't even realize that he had come in because they were all weeping and just, reeling from the diagnosis I'd given them earlier in the day. So they sort of saw him there, but, they didn't really process it. And he didn't talk to them. He didn't really talk to them much anyway. Went up to Taryn's room, put his hands on her abdomen, and a light glowed right over her liver. And he said that her liver lit up with a light. And he said this freaked him out, and he left without even talking to anybody. That was the last thing he was going to do, was to say, oh, by the way, a voice just told me to come over here, and now I see that Taryn's got a light glowing in her abdomen. No, he's not going to say stuff like that. And went home, and then just promptly forgot about it, and really didn't think about it again until, the sort of call went out to the family. Does anybody know, was there any kind of spiritual to Taryn's recovery? So, that is truly a miracle. This is a defect of her DNA. So somehow her DNA corrected itself. And this guy who, he's not a preacher, he's not a spiritual healer, he somehow facilitated it and really didn't even want to talk about it. So I go up to Children's Hospital, and one of my professors there, a guy named Dennis Christie, who is a guy that does not have a single spiritual bone in his body, at least at that time. And I said to him, so what do you make of this Taryn Hedlund case? He says, I don't know. But here's what he said to me. He said, but every year or so, something like this happens. So think about that. Here he is, the head of gastroenterology, University of Washington, Seattle Children's Hospital, tells me that every year or so, a child is miraculously cured. And in all of those cases, nobody did the kind of, in-depth research that I did, tracking down the brother-in-law, interviewing him and ever. Those are cases in which the parents, they sort of like, wow, my child's better, but didn't look any more than that. And I started to understand that miracles are happening all the time, and we're not recognizing them. We're not paying attention. And I invite anyone who's listening to this show, I hope that you're skeptical. I hope that you don't believe that miracles are real. I hope that you're like Taryn Hedlund's uncle, who certainly did not believe. But I want you to be skeptical and have an open mind and an open heart. Because if you pay attention to your life, I paid attention to my life. And let me give you some examples of after the Taryn Hedlund case, of things that I have personally observed. So, this is the story now I'm going to share with you, how an angel got me in trouble at my hospital. Almost got me to get a bad mark on my, on my clinical record. An angel did that to me. And here's how it happened. I was, at this time, I was resuscitated patients, by and large. I was the go-to person to, the team I was with, critically ill children at the hospital, infants. But I also had a private practice. So, one day, I'm seeing, 50 patients a day, all these ear infections, ear infection after ear infection, cold after cold. I mean, that's the life of the pediatrician. And, and every visit is boom, boom, boom. The waiting room is packed. So this family comes in, this mother and father. Didn't see a child. I said to him, so how can I help you today? They looked at me and they said, we want to understand what happened when our son died. It's been 1,183 days since our son died. And we know you've written books, and you're the great Dr. Morse, and you've been on Oprah. This, as an aside, I learned nobody cares that we publish this in the most prestigious medical journals. They only care that I was on Oprah. Anyway, so, these were deeply troubled parents. And they said, we've been to Raymond Moody, and we've been to Brian Weiss's workshops, and we've been to this weekend retreat, and we still can't get an answer. We still, every night, we can't sleep because we want to know what's happened to our son. And I'm like, hoping my nurses will rescue me. Hoping the nurses will say, oh, you got a phone call, Dr. Morse. Well, actually, that did happen. The nurses come in the room. They said, Dr. Morse, you got to get over to the hospital. An infant was just born, and the mother had what's called placenta previa, where the uterus separates from the placenta and puts the mother and baby at risk of death. It's a true medical emergency. So I got up, and I'm so sorry. I'd love to talk to you more, but I've got to get over to the hospital. And the mother was crushed, and she said, this is our son. This is our son. And she gives me a picture of him and said, because I told them, I said, we'll have to reschedule, but they said, no, we want you to see, who we're talking about. So I put the picture in my pocket, ran over to the hospital. So I'm over at the hospital. Infant is born, and I have 20 years experience, but for some reason that day I couldn't intubate the baby. So that intubation is when you put a tube into the lungs so we can then breathe for the baby who can't breathe for themselves. So I'm sitting there trying to resuscitate the patient, and I tried 3 or 4 times and I couldn't do it. So emergency room, the medics happened to be in the room, and he says to me, Doc, how about if you let me have a try? And in Seattle at that time, medics were trained in intubation. So, okay, and he successfully intubated the patient, and she survived, and everything went great. So I went back, I was writing my notes out in the, after the resuscitation, and one of the nurses says to me, so who was the medical student with you today? I said, I didn't have a medical student today. She said, yes, you did. Somebody came in, when you came in, and they were following you like the students do, and I saw them come out with you. And then she sees the picture in my pocket, and she points at it and she says, that's him. That's the medical student. I went back, called my nurse, and I said, don't let those parents leave. I went back and I told them, I said, your son wants to be in contact with you. Maybe your grief has created such a barrier that he can't get through. But one of the most respected nurses over at the hospital just told me that she saw him next to me. And I said, I want you to go back. They were from New York. They had come all the way from New York. I sent them back to New York, and I said, I want you to join the Compassionate Friends, which is a parent support group. I said, I want you to start to work on your grief. Start to heal. I want you to write a journal. Before you go to bed at night, ask a sincere question. And I don't care whether you believe in God or not. Just ask the question of the universe. And then in the morning, write down the first thought that comes to your head. And they did this. And they went back. They didn't go to the weekend workshop. They didn't have the great Dr. Morse, help them, or Raymond Moody. I pick on him because he's my brother-in-law. I've known Raymond for 30 years, so, but he gives these workshops and counsels people. But no, this mother, she looked to herself for the answer. And after a few days, she woke up in the middle of the night, and her mother and her son was standing at the foot of the bed. And he said, Mother, stop crying. I'm okay. I'm okay now. And the mother wrote to me, and she said, after that, for the first time in, however many days, she slept through the night. And, that was continued to sleep through the night. I'm not saying that healed her grief. Of course it didn't. But it changed her from what we call pathological grief. When you're, relentlessly, searching for an answer, into healthy grief, in which she starts to learn that grief is growth. And, for those of you listening, please do not tell a grieving parent that grief is growth. Don't. I've counseled, because so many patients of mine in the intensive care unit work have died. I've counseled hundreds of grieving parents, and they've told me, really, the only thing you should say to a grieving parent is nothing. You should listen. But anything you say is going to be the wrong thing. I know what you're going through. No, you don't. Unless you actually had a job done. There are many of the things that I used to say, we all do it in a well-meaning way. Anyway, so that's what happened with that parent. So how did I get in trouble with the hospital? Well, the anesthesiologist was pissed because the chain of command at the hospital is, if I can't resuscitate the patient, the next person is the anesthesiologist. And I should have told the anesthesiologist to attempt resuscitation. The medics are not employed by the hospital. They're not covered by the hospital's malpractice insurance. They have no role in resuscitating critically ill patients. I was out of line to ask this medic. And what was the medic doing in the room anyway? The medics are the ones who are driving, the ambulances, bringing the mother to the hospital. So, we have what they call M&M, morbidity and mortality conferences, and they convened one to have me explain why I had, done what I did. Even though it was a good outcome, there's still, this isn't the way we do things. So, I wanted to hear from the medic what was going on too. I hadn't gotten his name or anything like that. I tracked down the ambulance drivers, and I said, okay, so who was that guy that was in the delivery room? They looked at me like I was crazy. They're saying, Doc, we know better than that. Our job is to bring the patient to the hospital. Sometimes we're in the emergency room, but we're not going, treating patients, intubating patients in the hospital. We would never do anything like that. And plus, here's the two of us, and we didn't do it. We don't know what you're talking about. So, this was an angel. And as it turned out, they never held that morbidity and mortality conference because I never could track down the guy that supposedly did the intubation. And then it was, just, who wanted to deal with this anymore? Nobody wanted to ask any more questions. But think about it. If it hadn't been a situation where these parents had shoved a photograph into my hand, and then a nurse happened to say, if I hadn't been called into account of, why'd you let the medic intubate the patient? Nobody would have ever known that this happened. This wouldn't have been considered a miracle. Nobody would have thought that there was an angel in the delivery room. I mean, if there had been a more mellow anesthesiologist, the kind of guy that, let's face it, most people, hey, it has a good outcome, what do we care? This is just one of these very self-important people, that felt dissed. But most people don't do that. So how many other times is this happening? And we don't know that it's going on. And these kinds of things are happening. This is happening more than I've ever recognized. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to parents. Because the thing I want your listeners to understand is none of these stories would have been known if it hadn't been for my interest in near-death experiences and spiritual experiences. Well, miracles don't just happen to me. I'm not the only person that's seen them. They're happening all the time, but they're not being noticed. I'm going to just tell you one final one. I was in private practice as well. I have a practice of very complex patients, often angry patients, who felt that, their child had been mishandled, malpracticed, mistreated. Because I guess, after years of intensive care unit work, I didn't really feel a need to protect doctors or anything like that. I felt patients needed to know what happened. So a lot of patients came to me when they had unusual cases. So these parents, they brought their infant in to see me for a well checkup. And, I hadn't seen him for prenatal care. They were referred to me down from the University of Washington. Looking through the chart, and it said that their baby had what's called anencephaly, meaning that there was no brain. And this had been diagnosed through, the latest and greatest ultrasounds and imaging at the University of Washington. And believe me, no one is giving parents a diagnosis of anencephaly unless they are certain that that fetus has no brain. And unfortunately, in the climate of today, these babies are delivered. It's just a tragic thing. Oftentimes they're not even delivered in the delivery room. They're taken to another part of the hospital because they don't want these mothers, to be, then recuperating with all these healthy mothers with healthy babies. So I looked at these parents and I said, there must be a mistake. Because, obviously, I don't think that I have the right chart. Because your baby, is normal. And they looked at me and he said, oh, you read about those doctors up at the University of Washington that said our baby didn't have a brain. And they were laughing. They looked at me and they said, can you believe those idiots up there? They actually thought that our baby didn't have a brain. And they told us that. We knew it wasn't true. That was like the most absurd thing we had ever heard. So, we don't mind that that's why we came to see you, because we knew that you would understand that those doctors up there were idiots. But think about it. The doctors up at the University of Washington, they never got any follow-up. I didn't really even know who I would call up there, to tell them, radiologist, reads these reports. Obstetricians handled the communication with the parents. So they were completely unaware of this, that this baby that they had diagnosed as having no brain was born with a brain. Things are happening. Don't think that they're not. Once I became aware and started to really pay attention, I could tell you a half dozen other stories. I urge people to pay attention. See what's going on around you. That odd guy that's, shouldn't be where he's supposed to be, and he's giving you good advice, and you don't really know his name or who he is. Maybe that is an angel. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I've seen your program. It's beautiful. And miracles are happening. Here's a story I've never told anyone. So, it's a good story. So, I worked for North Northwest. And this is a story from when I was a resident. I had just gone to Alaska and came back. Then I was called out to Alaska again and came back. So I hadn't slept in 36 hours. And I came back and I told my wife, I'm turning off my pager, turning off the phone, I gotta sleep, and this was very irresponsible of me, but, because I was still on call. But I just told my wife, I said, look, if they get a hold of you, tell them I can't do anymore. They're going to have to page, the next person down the line, because I can't do it. So I turned off my pager, which, frankly, I've never done since then or before then, and slept. And my dad comes to me in a dream, and he says to me, wait, I gotta tell you, I have to stop right now, because I might forget to tell. The true spiritual experience is odd. It's bizarre. It's weird. For people who think that spiritual experiences, come from our desire to believe in something, our desire to think our child's in heaven, etc., etc., etc. That's not the case. Because these experiences, you can't make this stuff up. And that's what I'm going to tell you about this story. So my dad appears to me in my dream. Just like we're talking here. What they call a lucid dream. But my dad doesn't tell me he's dead. Or anything like that. My dad says to me, Melvin, call your answering service. So I woke up with a shock. And I was like, oh my God, this is some kind of, I should never have turned off my pager. My dad, coming, I've created this in my mind. In other words, I call my answering service and they say, Melvin, Dr. Morse, we've been trying to reach you for hours because your father died. And they can't reach you at home. Your phone isn't working. And they have been asking us to page you for hours. That's how this happened. And, and again, you You can't make this sort of thing up. These, I'll go back to that first patient that I saw that went to heaven. She was a deeply religious Mormon. But so I asked her parents, so what do you teach your children about going to heaven? They said, well, we teach them that the soul is like a hand and the body is a glove. So when you die, the glove comes off, but your hand goes on. But they don't teach them that you crawl down a tunnel to heaven like this little girl did that was lined with colored bricks. The little girl met a woman named Elizabeth. There's no Saint Elizabeth in the Mormon, belief system. There's no relative named Elizabeth. All these things are odd. They're strange. So if she's making this up out of her own imagination, why isn't it fitting then what we would expect to hear? And in our study of children who nearly died, we heard the same thing. One girl, the one who said to me, I didn't know you were allowed to talk to God. She drew me this picture, which accurately described her own resuscitation. Every detail was accurate, even to the point that I was wearing a hat. Why would we do that? Because we want the team leader to wear a hat so everyone knows who's running the resuscitation. So, an 8-year-old child, that's not coming from her religious imagination. And, she says to me, first she says, I saw a light who told me who I was and where I was to go. And then she said, I saw grandpas and grandmas and babies who are waiting to be born. But they're Presbyterians. They don't believe in reincarnation. There's no tradition of reincarnation. These parents are not New Agers or anything like that. They're the salt of the earth. There's no teachings. There's no way this little girl would have even heard about reincarnation. And yet, that's what tells us this experience is authentic. Is because they're odd. They don't fit what we think a spiritual experience should be like. Just like I was telling you, the man who facilitated the healing of Taryn Hedlund was the black sheep of the family, the least likely person, as he told me himself, to facilitate a spiritual healing. That's why he didn't tell anybody about it, because he thought they'd all laugh at him. God talked to you? So pay attention. And if it seems odd, it's probably real. That's what I got. Here's another thing I want to share with your listeners. Everybody sees these angels in a different way. And, I worked for Airlift Northwest. I worked with the medics. And in Seattle, they have a full medic rig where they can resuscitate patients. And there was a case in which the medics felt that an angel assisted them. And they told me this story because, I guess they felt I was probably the only doctor that listened to a story like this. They said they were having a difficult time resuscitating the patient. This was an adult, the story the medics told me. And they said that they perceived that a man was there and told them what to do next. But here's what's interesting about this story when I investigated it further. I wanted to, because I want to make sure, people make up stuff all the time, to get on Oprah. So, I always, want to actually look into these things. And I interviewed a lot of the bystanders and the other personnel, nurses, one of the nurses that was involved, the driver of the rig, and a couple of the bystanders. And this is interesting. None of them saw the angel, but one of them heard the angel. Said to me, it's weird. Now that you mention it, we heard, I heard a voice talking to the medics, but I just didn't think anything of it. And another person told me, it's so weird that you bring this up, because when I was watching this and sort of horrified, the medics resuscitating this patient, right on the street and throwing them in the rig, and taking them to the University of Washington. That I wasn't frightened. In fact, I thought God was there. I thought this was something beautiful. It was just a feeling. And then she said to me, but it couldn't have been real because, obviously, a person having a heart attack on the street is not, that's not anything, that should be spiritual. So we don't all perceive these experiences the same way. Just like, there's auditory learners, and there's visual learners, and there's kinesthetic learners. Some people learn best if they're moving. Other people learn best if you talk to them. Other people learn best if they can read it. The same thing is true of spiritual experiences. So don't wait to see an angel. Maybe you're going to hear that angel. Or maybe you'll just have a feeling that you would otherwise just dismiss. Just go, that can't be true. We tend to trust our instincts when it's bad stuff. And then when it's good stuff, we tend to dismiss it. Go, that was just a crazy widow's dream, instead of something that was real. So start to listen to your heart. Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.